Hello and welcome to the Lonestar Collective, the official podcast of the Texas Cannabis Collective. I'm your host, Chris Grisolia, and I am joined this week by a very special guest. He is the son of well-known physician and cannabis activist, Dr. Lester Grinspoon, board member of Doctors for Cannabis Regulation, and author of his book, Free Refills, The Doctor Confronts His Addiction, and now his new book that I'm thoroughly enjoying, Seeing Through the Smoke, a cannabis specialist untangles the truth about marijuana. Welcome, Dr. Peter Grinspoon.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. I appreciate it. I love the way you explain in this book the branching of the cultural perceptions around cannabis. Can you first introduce yourself and give us a little bit of your background, and then give our audience a quick breakdown of what you mean by the branching of cultural perceptions?
Absolutely. Well, I'm Peter Grinspoon. I'm a primary care doctor, and I teach medicine at Harvard Medical School. I'm in Boston. I've been a cannabis specialist for probably the last 20 years. As Chris mentioned, my dad was a very legendary cannabis researcher and scholar, Lester Grinspoon. So I've been involved in this issue my entire life. Also growing up, my older brother Danny was fighting a losing battle against leukemia, but cannabis incredibly helped him during the last year of his life hold down food and, not be just alone in his room barfing all the time. He was able to play with his little brother. So that was very impactful to me, seeing the alleviation of suffering in a family member. So I went through medical school sort of knowing that cannabis is a medicine, and I've just been interested in it my entire life between my brother and my dad. One thing that really never ceases to amaze me is the split in the belief system we have in our society about cannabis. Depending on who you talk to, which doctor, legislator, social worker, politician, you could either get that it's like, the devil's lettuce with no medical benefits, this evil drug that's addictive and making people crazy, or you can get that it's a helpful natural wellness and medication that helps people. It sounds like they're talking about two different plants grown on different planets, not the same plant, that we all know as marijuana or cannabis. So in my book, I talk about how dysfunctional it is and how confusing it is to teens, to politicians, to doctors, to have two incompatible belief systems about it. And I just kind of show how it split off and how it became, we ended up in these two camps that are like sniping at each other. And then I go through each of the harms, and I go through the latest science. How dangerous is it to drive? How bad is it for teenagers? How bad is it for pregnancy? How addictive is it? And all the benefits, like what can it help with? Can it help with epilepsy? Can it help with autism? Can it help with chronic pain? Can it help with insomnia? And I try to come up with a reasonable sort of middle path that, I think there's enough common ground that we can all start agreeing on things as opposed to being in these hostile camps that sort of radicalize each other. So hoping with this book to kind of update everybody on like the latest science and really explain why doctors should be much more interested in it and should be much more helpful to patients when they ask about cannabis, and trying to come up with some common ground that we could all agree upon.
Yeah, absolutely. One quote in the book that I think is great is, cannabis is a unique drug on every level. It's not heroin light or sort of like alcohol. Please explain what you're trying to describe with this quote.
Well, I get very frustrated with the addiction psychiatrists, for example, who for some reason we've deferred to around cannabis for the last half century. They, haven't had there hasn't historically been a big difference between what they've said about cannabis and what the U.S. government said about cannabis during the war on drugs. So I don't think they've done a very good job getting the cannabis issue right. And I just feel like there's so much that's unique about cannabis. It's a complicated plant with like 500 different molecules in it. That's why different types of cannabis affect you differently. Some are good for pain. Some make you sleepy and relaxed and happy. Others make you energetic. You like go clean your house or go out dancing, or in my case, decide to write another book. It really affects people differently. And, the way the addiction psychiatrists talk about it is like intoxicated, non-intoxicated, like with alcohol, you're either intoxicated or non-intoxicated. Well, in reality, cannabis affects us in so many different ways, some of them good, some of them bad. And it really helps people. In other people it can hurt. Some people can get addicted to it, but it can help people with their like mindfulness and their connection to other people and their insight and their relaxation and their appreciation of creativity and sexuality and nature and art. And it can help people with so many different medical issues. So to talk about it like another drug, like methamphetamine, which is purely negative, as like intoxicated, not intoxicated, is just such a limited way to talk about it. It misses all the nuance and all the benefits. There are harms and benefits. And I think a lot of this goes to the fact that a lot of these quote unquote experts about cannabis haven't actually tried it. If you try it yourself, say you're in a legal state and you try it yourself, you realize it's not this big, scary drug like methamphetamine. It's actually has its harms, it has its benefits, but it's very complicated how it helps people. And you can't just reduce it to like intoxicated versus non-intoxicated. Like you're talking about, did someone have 1 beer versus 12 beers? It's like a very complicated drug that can be harmful or helpful in a lot of different ways. And we need to understand it in like a 3-dimensional manner, not just talk about it like you're intoxicated or not intoxicated. It really misses a lot of the subtleties of what you really have to understand if you want to understand cannabis.
Yeah, that's what I try to tell people all the time, because people think of me as kind of an authority because of all my advocacy that I do here in Texas, right? So I get a lot of questions, and I don't mind if I don't know the answer. I have a list of experts like yourself that I can reach out to, or I will look for the answer myself and get back to them and try to get them the correct answer. Not ever trying to give any medical advice or anything. Somebody needs medical advice, I tell them they should seek that from a doctor. But they're asking me like questions about effects and of this, that, the other thing, from as far as different methods of ingestion and whatnot. Those are the main kind of questions I get. But what I tell them is it basically depends on the person. And that's the easiest way I know to explain it is everybody's physiology is different when it comes to plant medicine. And that's one reason why synthetics work better in pharmaceuticals, so to speak. And a lot of people don't understand that concept, I guess.
Well, that's a big reason why doctors are unfamiliar with cannabis and have trouble like adopting it. If I treat you for high blood pressure, I'll be like, take 10 milligrams of lisinopril once a day and I'll check your blood pressure in a month. With cannabis, it's much more dependent on the patient, and the patient, it's like trial and error. The biggest way to get in trouble with cannabis is to take too big a dose, and then you can get very anxious. Nobody overdoses and dies, but it's very unpleasant to take too big a dose. So when I start people on cannabis, the main thing I tell them is to start low and to go slow and to take your time getting yourself up to a helpful dose. If we're going to make a mistake in the medication, we're going to take too little, be a little disappointed, and take more the next day. We're not going to take too much. And, the different consumption methods all have their advantages. Doctors don't like to recommend smoking because it's not good for your lungs, but certainly
Sure.
People can use a dry herb vaporizer where these little devices, they're inexpensive and they heat it up high enough to extract the medicine, but they don't burn it, so you don't get the combustion products. And the advantage of that is you get immediate relief. If you have nausea, say you're getting chemotherapy, or you have like a spasm of pain, you can puff and get immediate relief. The advantage of an edible is that it can last a lot longer. So if you have like chronic pain, smoking doesn't really help for more than a couple hours, and you don't want to be smoking all day. And if you take an edible, the downside is that it doesn't kick in right away. So you have to be careful with the dosing. You don't want to make the mistake that a lot of people do is they take a gummy and then nothing happens. So they take 5 more after 20 minutes and then they have an awful experience because they get way too high a level. But generally speaking, if you take your time and get the right dose of an edible, you can get long acting relief from your discomfort. And then some people use a small dose of an edible to take the edge off their pain or their nausea or their anxiety. And then they take a puff from their vaporizer if they have a flare up. So you can do a little bit of both. You can sort of mix and match, but patients really have to figure this out for themselves. Ideally, under the guidance of a doctor. We're trying to educate the doctors about cannabis. They don't know very much about it because they haven't been taught much. And much of what doctors have been taught was like piped in directly from the war on drugs. So it's a whole new world of like educating doctors, and doctors are very eager to have helpful and actually accurate information about cannabis. So we're going to see things changing for the better a lot in the next 5 years. I think access is going to open up. As you say, tons of studies are coming out. We're learning more about it. Harms, benefits, we're learning more. And I think doctors and nurses are going to know a lot more in terms of how to like at least have a sensible discussion with their patients about it.
Yeah, I think something else that's happening too is with the states that have legal markets, both medical and adult use, we're seeing that the sky is not falling. We're seeing that teen use rates are dropping, not rising, and things like that. So, and then what was it? AMA just published in January the study about opioid use declining in these states as well. So that's all positive feedback, the way I see it. So we're going to have to take our first.
Notice there's not a single state that's trying to unlegalize cannabis. No. It's not legal in like 38 states medically, and now 23 states for adult use, recreational use. And like the taxes are great, the arrests are down, people are doing well public health wise. It's not flawless, but it's definitely, people are very, very excited with how well legalization's gone. I just want to point out that you don't hear anybody talking about like recalling the legalization. Everybody's really, really happy with it.
Yeah, the sky is not falling, as they say. We're going to have to take our first sponsor break real quick. When we come back, I want to get into something you talk about in the book, and that's what the true harms of the war on drugs and prohibition consequences have been when we get back. So we're going to take our first sponsor break, and we'll be back in just a minute.
Howdy, Colt Power here. These days, many people are choosing to add CBD to their wellness routine. Why? Some like CBD for how it may help them with their focus. Others enjoy the way the plant compound may assist them with their sore muscles and relaxation. For me, CBD has been a game changer in keeping my old sports injuries managed so I can work out and be present for my family. If you've ever been curious about CBD, I invite you to check out our Texas-grown, Texas-made products at powerbiofarms.com. That's power, BIOPHARMS.com.
Thrive Apothecary offers an experience truly unique from anything else in Texas. A full-service cannabis solution that is doctor-owned and offers customers every level of cannabis legally available in Texas. From traditional CBD products to emerging hemp-derived THC edibles, smokables, and now medical cannabis. As a licensed medical cannabis provider, prospective patients from anywhere in Texas can book a sponsored online eligibility consultation to determine if they qualify for a medical marijuana prescription from the comfort of their own home. Plus, for Texas veterans, the first prescription appointment is donated by Thrive. Visit thrivetx.com for more information.
Welcome back to the Lonestar Collective podcast, the official podcast of the Texas Cannabis Collective, distributed on Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, and many more, to give Texans information regarding policy, industry, and culture. And now, back to this week's show.
Welcome back to the Lonestar Collective podcast, the official podcast of the Texas Cannabis Collective. I'm joined this week by our very special guest, Peter Grinspoon. I'm sure you have that happen a lot, like with my last name, Grisolia. I get all kinds of things, and I have to tell people the easiest way to pronounce my name is just think of Magnolia, and you can say Grisolia. But I hear granola bar, grizzly bear, you name it.
I had a patient call me Dr. Spoonbird. Even though I was her doctor for 12 years, she called me Dr. Spoonbird instead of Dr. Grinspoon. So I thought that was...
Now that's a weird one. I don't see where you'd get that. Back to your wonderful book, Seeing Through the Smoke. You talk about in here something that's very near and dear to me, the true harms of the war on drugs to cannabis users. Elaborate a little bit about that without giving away too much from your book for us, please?
Well, cannabis, in my opinion, never should have been criminalized. And it was never criminalized for health purposes. It was just criminalized due to like sort of a lot of racism and competing commercial interests. They didn't want the competition from the hemp industry. And, you know, people use cannabis. They have all along because it helps them. It helps them in a whole variety of levels that I talk about in my book, but certainly with pain, with anxiety, with insomnia, with nausea, vomiting, weight loss, appetite, if you have multiple sclerosis or Crohn's disease or irritable bowel. And so people have been using cannabis all along. The question is whether we let people use it, legalize it, and give them a safe supply and generate tax revenue and have everything out in the open so that people can get help, or whether we criminalize it and arrest people. And this has which is what we've done for the last half century until very recently. Now, as we were just talking about, 23 states have full adult legalization and 38 have medical legalization. Now, having this been criminalized for the last half century, we've created 20 million arrests for simple nonviolent cannabis possession, mostly in Black and brown people. And this has just been so devastating. People end up in prison for no reason whatsoever. And furthermore, even if you don't end up in prison, getting arrested, having a criminal record can affect your education, your student loans. It can affect your housing. It can affect your employment opportunities. I mean, it has been absolutely devastating to entire neighborhoods. And with the states that have legalized, we've seen the arrests go down. We've been able to funnel some of the money back to these neighborhoods that have been devastated. We are collecting more tax dollars now in Massachusetts from cannabis than we are from alcohol. And the legalization is going really, really well. And it just, you know, it breaks my heart that we have these 20 million is such a big number, useless arrests for cannabis possession. And the sooner we legalize federally, as far as I'm concerned, internationally, the better, because why make someone into a criminal for doing what they would do anyways? And as you said earlier, Chris, with the states that have legalized, the teen usage isn't going up. It's either staying stable or going down. The only thing that's going up is the safety of the product that people are using because they're buying it in a store instead of like for some drug dealer, and the tax revenues are going up. What's going down is all the misery, all the harm, all the criminality that we don't need, all the crime. So far, it's been a virtually unqualified success legalizing cannabis. You know, we could do better. You know, we need to have better testing of the product. We need to have better labeling. We need to have better education. You know, I have some current concerns about making, you know, these things into edibles that a 4-year-old would eat. I think we could do a much better job with labeling and packaging. But overall, It's been like a tremendous success, which is why every year more states legalize, both medically and recreationally, though we're running out of states to legalize medically because at some point we're already at 38. It's going to be all 50 states. And then you have to ask yourself, why is it going to really be legal in all 50 states and still illegal on the federal level? That makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah, still a Schedule 1. Yeah, that makes absolutely no sense. Ludicrous. I have a very big topic for me, and before I get into that, I want to just touch on what you said there about the whole aspect of it, which what I tell lawmakers, and I've done a lot of talking to lawmakers this session here in Texas. I've had like 33 meetings with different offices throughout the session, some with the lawmakers themselves, most with just staffers, but you know, legalization is not the big topic we want to talk about here. So we always start off with our priorities are expanding the medical program and making it more beneficial to the patients and more affordable to the patients. Decriminalizing or reducing penalties for minor possession is always our next priority. And then I always go, you know, and if you want to talk about the legalization subject, I'd be happy to talk about it. If you don't want to talk about it, I just ask you to give me the opportunity to ask you 2 simple questions. And every time they've said, okay, what's the questions? And the first question is have we stopped anyone in the state of Texas who wants to use cannabis from using cannabis with any of these laws?
No, you've just made the cannabis they use more dangerous, and you've made them commit a criminal act. And then if someone gets into trouble, you make it so they can't ask for help. It's a disaster across the board.
Exactly. And so the second question is that when they answer that, if they answer it, they don't answer it. Some of them give you the deer in the headlights look because they don't want to answer it, right? But after we get past that question, the second question is, wouldn't it make more sense to have a legal, regulated, tested market where we have the protections in place for our youth, and we can have a revenue stream where we can take and funnel money from that revenue stream into teen addiction problems, mental health, and other areas where we're lacking? Doesn't that make more sense? And not a one of them can say no.
Well, what's interesting is what you said before, though, the teen rates aren't rising.
Mm-hmm.
There are different theories for why that's the case. One of it's that like a drug dealer will sell cannabis to anybody. They don't check cards. I mean, it's impossible to get into a dispensary in Massachusetts unless you have your driver's license and your cannabis card. And they really, really, really check carefully.
Sure.
Number two is that like teens like to rebel and be different and be, very on the cutting edge. And like when grandma's taking a puff for arthritis, it's just not quite as exciting as it used to be. It sort of loses its edgy, cool. So maybe it's just not cool anymore, but the rates have been very stable. So it hasn't been harming our teens, and it's been actually helping our adults to legalize. And, decriminalizing really helps as well. But I'm more a favor of legalization just because with decriminalization, you don't get in trouble for having it, but it's still illegal to buy it and sell it. Yeah. And why not have all of that under above board and taxed and regulated? Everybody's happy with it in Massachusetts and Maine and all these, and in Colorado, because from the consumer, you can get safe products. You know what's in them. You know what the dose is. You're not going to take too much. If you get a 5 milligram gummy bear, it's going to be a 5 milligram gummy bear. It's not going to be, 100 milligrams. Like if you were just buying it from a drug dealer, you could be taking, Lord knows what. And also the state likes it because they're collecting taxes and the harms go down. Again, if somebody gets addicted, they're addicted to something legal and it's open. They could just ask for help. It's not like this underground thing. So I'm more in favor of legalization just because you generate taxes, you have a safe product, nobody gets in trouble for buying and selling it. It sort of doesn't make sense. You're allowed to have it, but you're not allowed to buy it or sell it. Well, where do you get it? Like magically from the cannabis fairies? I mean, you have to buy it from somewhere. Why not have that be legal? But yeah, no, I mean, I respect people with all kinds of different opinions, but that's just my opinion that I am a firm believer that legalization is the safest and most sensible way to go with cannabis. And that's what we're going to see. In 5 years, it's going to be legal federally and it's going to be legal in all the states. I mean, look at New Hampshire the Governor Sununu is trying to be conservative on this issue, but he's surrounded by states where it's legal and everybody just goes across the board. All they're doing is losing $20 billion a year in tax revenue by keeping it illegal and wasting the time of their police officers and needlessly arresting people. It's so silly. So he's sort of trying to even get towards legalization as well because it just works so much better. It's just a thing of the past, keeping it illegal. So I'll bet that even in Texas in 5 years, it's going to be legal.
And it's going to depend on who our governor and lieutenant governor are, because I mean, really and truthfully, I think if we were to get a legalization bill, and I could be wrong, a lot of people argue with me on this point, but I think that if we were to get a full legalization bill that had regs and revenue stream all set up in it, everything ready to go, to Governor Abbott's desk with, majority votes through the House and Senate, I believe he would sign it. The problem here, in my opinion, and a lot of people agree with me on this, but they say it's both of them, is our lieutenant governor. And he's just adamant that the people aren't there yet, even though every poll in the last 6 years has said 67% or more say just legalize it already, so and of course he's just got reelected, so we'll have him through this session, the interim, and then the next session, and then he's already announced he's running for reelection in 3 years. So if he gets reelected, we'll still have the same roadblocks. Of course, my argument there is if 67% of the people would get vocal on this subject, he would change his mind.
No, I agree. I mean, I know Massachusetts is very different from Texas, but if someone were to take that anti-cannabis position in Massachusetts, they'd never get elected with people are very much in support of you could be in support of legalizing it without even being in support of cannabis. You should just think it's not a thing that the government should control us and criminalize us for. So that would be a very unpopular position in many places, not many places in this country. Like you'd never get elected in Colorado or even Montana with that anti-cannabis position. So that's really, really amazing to hear.
Well, the problem, the way he gets elected is he's a strong conservative. It's a conservative state, and it's the conservative principles that gets him elected, not his position on cannabis.
Right, but 94% of Americans support legal access to medical marijuana.
Yeah.
Like, name anything else that 94% of Americans agree on. They don't even agree that the sky is blue or the earth is flat. And who would have thought cannabis would be like the thing that unites people? But these days, you're really out of touch if you're against particularly medical. Like, who's against medical marijuana? That's just cruel. People are suffering from pain, from nausea, from anxiety. Why wouldn't you let medical patients have this relatively plant-based medication that alleviates their suffering?
That's what always been my testimony on the medical bills is I just start out with, Dr. William O'Shaughnessy was treating epilepsy, among other things, successfully in the United States in 1850 with cannabis.
Well, I also have a lot of very conservative patients that are on medical cannabis. I mean, I don't think it's a conservative liberal issue. I think it's like empathy. Do you care about sick patients?
Yeah, well, it's like so many other things. Unless it happens to them or someone they know that's close to them, it's not real, I guess. It's one of those kind of subjects,
Well, that's sort of how we got a lot of people sympathetic to the opioid crisis. It started affecting people like your nephew or your cousin or your friend. And then so many people were affected by it. They actually started being, having empathy for people who are addicted, not just looking down upon them. And it's the same thing with cannabis. Like, it gets harder and harder to find someone who doesn't have someone they know has had a good experience with medical cannabis. So I think that's a really important point about why the tide is changing. And that supports my original prediction that certainly within 10 years, I'll bet it's going to be legal, certainly for medical all across the country.
Yeah. Well, with that being said, we're going to have to stop and take our second sponsor break. And then I want to get into that topic that I touched on a minute ago, the evidence versus anecdotal evidence conversation, which is one that is always very, very deep for me. So when we come back, we'll get into that. So right after this next sponsor break, we're going to talk with Dr. Grinspoon about what is anecdotal evidence and what is the difference between anecdotal evidence and actual evidence when it comes to medical science when we come back from the sponsor break.
Howdy, Colt Power here. These days, many people are choosing to add CBD to their wellness routine. Why? Some like CBD for how it may help them with their focus. Others enjoy the way the plant compound may assist them with their sore muscles and relaxation. For me, CBD has been a game changer in keeping my old sports injuries managed so I can work out and be present for my family. If you've ever been curious about CBD, I invite you to check out our Texas-grown, Texas-made products at powerbiofarms.com. That's power, BIOPHARMS.com.
Thrive Apothecary offers an experience truly unique from anything else in Texas. A full-service cannabis solution that is doctor-owned and offers customers every level of cannabis legally available in Texas. From traditional CBD products to emerging hemp-derived THC edibles, smokables, and now medical cannabis. As a licensed medical cannabis provider, prospective patients from anywhere in Texas can book a sponsored online eligibility consultation to determine if they qualify for a medical marijuana prescription from the comfort of their own home. Plus, for Texas veterans, the first prescription appointment is donated by Thrive. Visit thrivetx.com for more information.
Welcome back to the Lonestar Collective podcast. the official podcast of the Texas Cannabis Collective, distributed on Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, and many more, to give Texans information regarding policy, industry, and culture. And now, back to this week's show.
Welcome back to the Lonestar Collective, the official podcast of the Texas Cannabis Collective. I'm joined this week by my very special guest, Dr. Peter Grinspoon. Welcome back, Doctor.
Glad to be back.
Just before we went to the break, I made a comment about anecdotal evidence, and just to bring this subject up to par, why this is so important to me is because that's the argument we always get from our lawmakers, right? When you talk about medical cannabis and wanting different things added and whatnot. Needless to say, they always come back with the very first line is, well, we've only got anecdotal evidence, right? And to me, when you have in vitro studies, that's not necessarily, that's anecdotal evidence, but it's not the anecdotal evidence by what they're considering anecdotal evidence. And I just want to know, every time I get a medical professional in front of me that I can ask this question to clarify it, I always like to get your opinions on what they're talking about. I think my thoughts are, when they're talking about anecdotal evidence, they're talking about Johnny and Susie over here in their trailer house growing some marijuana, making an extract or tincture or something and using it, and then saying whether or not it worked. And that's what I envision lawmakers say or think of when they're thinking of anecdotal evidence, when in reality, anecdotal evidence is a lot more than that, is it not?
Well, the debate over legalization is sort of accompanied by a debate over what counts as evidence. Because, there's a certain type of evidence that doctors like called randomized controlled trials, where ideally you're double blinded. The patient doesn't know if they've been given the medicine or a placebo. The doctor doesn't know. And that way you can see if the medicine actually has an effect as opposed to the placebo effect. And this is really important to have this type of evidence. If we want to know if a certain type of chemotherapy works on a different cancer or something like that. But it's been used sort of as a bludgeon against cannabis legalization advocates, because they are saying, well, we don't have the same kind of randomized controlled trials for cannabis. But the main reason we don't is because, as part of the war on drugs, our government, U.S. government, which funded 80 to 90% of worldwide drug research, didn't fund any studies into the benefits of cannabis. They only studied researchers and research into the harms. So we've only been looking in one direction. Absence of evidence of benefit is not evidence of absence of benefit. We just don't have the exact studies that doctors like. Now, we have a lot of things we do in medicine without randomized controlled trials. Like aspirin and lithium were brought into medical practice before they even invented randomized controlled trials. And then think of aspirin. If we only looked at the harms and not at the benefits, we think this is a drug that people get allergic to that gives you ulcers and causes you to bleed. We'd never know that aspirin can help prevent heart attacks and strokes. We're sort of in the same condition with cannabis. But there are many, many other types of evidence. There's this whole new field of evidence called real world evidence, which is taking data from patient-reported outcomes, from patient registries, such as like all the state registries with all these cannabis patients. And they're kind of aggregating that data, and they're really able to show a lot of benefits, or in some cases, no benefit. But it's just a very small part of the picture that you need a randomized controlled trial to know that something is correct in medicine. I've been a primary care doctor at Harvard for a quarter century. Tons of what we do is done without randomized controlled trials. We'd rather have them than not have them, but we use real world evidence for a lot of other things, and it's working really well. So I think that's sort of an argument of the past. I don't think that's still a good argument, because there are more randomized controlled trials now showing the benefits of cannabis now that the government doesn't have as much of a vice hold on the research. Secondly, there's all this great real world evidence. And thirdly, it's just hard to dismiss, an anecdote. One or two people say something, sure, people can say anything. But if you have like 1 million people saying the same things, like why would 1 million people say that cannabis is helping with their pain? If they're using cannabis, they're not using, sought after drugs like Vicodin or Percocet or Oxycontin. They're just using cannabis. Much safer. If it's helping people with pain, why would we doubt it? I mean, again, as you say, the anecdote of like one or two people, sure, someone could think that drinking Gatorade helps cure their foot fungus or whatever. People think anything. But if 1 million people are saying the same thing and they're saying it for no good reason except that it's helping them, and they're doing it instead of asking for more dangerous painkillers, I don't think so. I think that's an argument of the past. I just think it's been argued for so long that people don't realize it's an argument of the past. But these days we have plenty of evidence. I go over, in my book, Seeing Through the Smoke, I go over the latest evidence for all of these conditions, and there's plenty of evidence. Now, there's some areas where we don't have great evidence. Like a lot of parents swear that it helps their kids who have autism. We're still figuring that out. The preliminary evidence is very encouraging. And, the same is true with cancer. In the cells, cannabis is very effective curing different types of cancer, but it hasn't been shown in humans yet. So I say, cancer, see an oncologist, get chemotherapy, and use the cannabis for the pain, the nausea, the weight loss, the insomnia, the anxiety. Use cannabis for all the ancillary issues of the cancer. So some areas we don't know, some areas we're still figuring out. But overall, I think the quote, we don't have enough evidence for cannabis, unquote, is much more of a argument of the past, because it's really ignoring the thousands of studies that are coming out every year showing its benefits.
Yeah, I will admit it's not one that I've heard as much this current session here in Texas, but there are still a few lawmakers that want to throw it around out there.
And doctors have been just like acculturated to believe there isn't enough evidence, and there's just not enough of one type of evidence because the government wouldn't fund it. But if you look at evidence a little more broadly, like we do in all other parts of medicine, there's plenty of evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that's a hot topic for a lot of people, and you kind of touched on it earlier. People want to argue back and forth, and this probably fits into what you're talking about, the two sides, but you hear it being argued all the time, and that's, can someone get addicted to cannabis?
Yes, people get addicted to cannabis. Teens are more likely to get addicted than adults are because they can learn to medicate away their sadness, anxiety, loneliness, boredom, anger by taking a puff or two rather than learning how to self-soothe, to the extent that addiction can be a learning disorder. So teens are more susceptible. The rates of addiction are not as high by far as the addiction psychiatrists claim they are. They have exaggerated the rates of addiction and use that as another bludgeon against the legalization advocates. The way they exaggerate it is they define cannabis addiction as cannabis use disorder. And you only need 2 out of 11 criteria to qualify as addicted to cannabis, one of which is tolerance and one of which is withdrawal. Now, when doctors prescribe opiates, for medical purposes, we don't include tolerance or withdrawal as part of the definition because all medical opiate patients have tolerance and withdrawal. And why give all of them a diagnosis of addiction? It's horrible. People, get stigmatized when they have a diagnosis of addiction. It actually hurts them. And the same with cannabis. They define it so broadly, and they include cravings, intolerance, and withdrawal. You get cravings, intolerance, and withdrawal if you stop using your SSRI for depression or your Valium or your opiate. So we've managed to create a definition of cannabis addiction that ensnares needlessly all the medical cannabis patients. So that's why these quote unquote cannabis experts saying 30% of adults who use cannabis get addicted. Is probably more like 3 or 4%. It's not 30%. And that's such a misunderstanding of both cannabis and of addiction. And furthermore, the quality of a cannabis addiction, people aren't like robbing pharmacies or breaking bones like they do to get opiates. It's just a different quality of addiction. It can be very destructive. People who are addicted to cannabis do need empathy and treatment like they do for any other addiction. But at the same time, it's been very much exaggerated. And that gets back to like the two sides I was talking about before. The one side's like, nobody gets addicted to cannabis. It's not addicted. I've smoked for years and I can stop. The other side thinks that like a third of adults who use it get addicted, which is nothing but drug war paranoia. It has no bearing on actual, like the patients we see on day to day. I joke in my book, where are all these 30% of adult cannabis users hiding? Like, where are they living? Who are they? Nobody seems to know who they are. It's just a statistic around by the addiction people. So people do get addicted, but it's been wildly exaggerated. It is a problem. It requires treatment, but it like anything with addiction, if we become hysterical and exaggerate, people tune us out right away.
Well, and that's something that, I like to point out when people get PO'd, when I say, yes, you can get addicted to cannabis, and I say this, I'm a fellow recovering addict myself. I had a cocaine habit in my early 20s, pretty extensive one. Did a lot of freebasing back in the 80s, 80s and early 90s. Luckily, I was strong enough that all I had to do was get away from the source, and I was able to stop on my own. But I spent a year and a half out of work in my mom's living room, sitting on the couch, just talking to her. So that was kind of my rehab, more or less, But what I always point out about addiction, having been down that road and understanding it better than someone who has not been down that road, you can be addicted to virtually anything. It doesn't even have to be a substance necessarily. That's what a lot of people don't understand about addiction.
Addiction is just compulsive use despite negative consequences. So if you're spending all your money and you're in debt, or you're gambling all the time, or people are addicted to sex, people are addicted to eating, it doesn't just have to be a drug. Addiction is a behavior, not a drug.
Exactly the point I was getting at. That it's a behavior, not the substance. It's the behavior. Absolutely.
Well, ironically too, like another propaganda point from the war on drugs is that marijuana was a gateway for teenagers to use harder drugs, and that all turned out to be complete nonsense. I mean, everybody who's addicted to heroin drank milk as a kid. They are associated, but that doesn't mean the drinking milk caused you to take the heroin. It's just, you can't say these associations are one thing causes the other, but they've been doing that but ironically, many people are finding cannabis to be a gateway out of addiction.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
A gateway out of opiate addiction, out of alcohol addiction. I've had a lot of success getting people off alcohol using cannabis. And I just think it's an irony, because it really is a gateway, but it's not a gateway onto drugs. It can be a gateway off for a lot of people.
You combine the people that say they've gotten off of alcohol and off of opioids using cannabis with the people that have gotten off the benzos and antidepressants for PTSD using cannabis. The people that have gotten off of pharmaceuticals for things like arthritis and other things that, they were taking 4 or 5 pills a day for. And now they smoke a little cannabis in the morning, or they eat a gummy in the morning and eat one at night before they go to bed. And that, that takes care of it.
I have a patient who's a Vietnam vet. He's in his he's probably like 70. He was drinking 6 shots of vodka twice a day just to cope with the intrusive thoughts and nightmares and memories from his combat experience in Vietnam. He was miserable. He was like alone. He was in his house. He was isolated. He was depressed. And we transitioned him, and now he takes like a puff twice a day from his vaporizer. He's not only not drinking, his liver test is normal. He's not going to die of like cirrhosis or anything, but also he's out with his buddies again. He's fishing. He's going to the vet center. He's like socializing, and his life is just so much happier and normalized with just a small amount of medical cannabis. And given that nothing else works for PTSD except, you can piecemeal treat the insomnia by giving a heavy-duty sleeping pill, or the anxiety by giving a heavy-duty tranquilizer. I don't think anything's nearly as effective for PTSD as cannabis is, especially because it could treat so many different symptoms at once. It could help with the sleep, the nightmares, the anxiety, the insomnia, the stress, the anger, the irritability. So I think it's just amazing how much of a gulf there is between your average veteran who believes that cannabis is like this wondrous treatment for PTSD and the psychiatrists, again, who just refuse to admit that a single person has benefited using cannabis for PTSD. They're so out of touch. And as my dad used to say, as you mentioned earlier, he was a cannabis scholar, in the absence of really good evidence, you could do something really, really radical that they used to do a long time ago, which is listen to your patients.
Yeah. Boy, wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't that be something? Well, that's going to probably wrap it up for us. Before we go, because I think I could probably talk for hours on end with you on this subject. I know you could, because it's what you do for a living on a large part. But before we go, be sure and tell our audience where we can get your book and any of that good stuff.
Oh, sure. Well, most bookstores should have my book, but it's also on Amazon. You just click in Seeing Through the Smoke or Peter Grinspoon, and it pops up on Amazon. Or they can just go to my website, petergrinspoon.com. It's spelled grin like smile, spoon like fork. So it's petergrinspoon.com and my book. And there's a way to contact me if you have questions, and other speaking appearances, podcasts show up. So that's a good source of information as well.
Okay, and we'll put all those links in the show description as well when the show goes out. I want to thank you again, Doctor, for joining us and telling us a little bit about your book and your opinions on cannabis. And I just want to tell you, I've followed your work, like I said earlier, for several years now, and we are probably more on the same page on this subject than anybody else that I've ever interviewed. Because
great minds think alike, right?
Well, thank you. I take that as a compliment. So thanks again, and I'll keep up your great work. And, we'll be more than happy to have you on anytime.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thank you for the great conversation.
Absolutely. That's going to do it for this show this week, folks. And our great guest with Dr. Peter Grinspoon and his book, Seeing Through the Smoke. I would recommend that's a book that you go get, because like I said in the beginning of the show, I'm only halfway through it and I can't hardly put it down. So be sure you check it out, folks. That's going to do it. And we'll see y'all next week.